Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be going over my top tier tweaks in the Paradox Rift metagame. The tournaments are still coming thick and fast in the Paradox Rift meta. We have 3 regionals going on in the month of January. Portland is coming up this weekend, so that's the earliest sort of knee-jerk that some of these deck lists are going to look towards. But also I have my eye on Charlotte and Liverpool regionals as well, as I'm going to be playing in Liverpool at the very least, and I'm always interested in these high-level tournaments because we are usually reacting to the successful results. So certainly we're going to be taking into account some of the recent San Antonio and Stuttgart results, as well as the Kyoto Champions League tournament as well, for a little bit of context as to why I'm teching the lists in certain ways. So let's get straight into it with what I think are the top contenders right now in the game. I believe there's probably about 8 top contenders, and there's a few other archetypes that are kind of vying for contention that you can see in the bottom right of your screen right now. I feel like Charizard, Gardevoir, Miraidon, Giratina Lost Zone Box, as well as a Mew have been the most successful decks so far in this format. But I also think Lost Zone Box is carving its own history right now with all sorts of different builds coming out of the woodwork. We've seen the Radiant Charizard build have a resurgence with a victory in the Stuttgart, which was phenomenal. We've seen it continue to do quite well in San Antonio as well. Another bunch of top placements. And then Lost Zone Box that play Mirage Gate have really gone crazy. Kyogre's still doing well, but has a smorgasbord of attackers available to it. Sometimes even thin lines of V-Stars are finding their way in, with the likes of Tord Reklev really rocking some insane deck lists. Oftentimes Roaring Moon and Iron Hands EX both being the sort of cornerstone for type coverage, as well as just some of the highest power attacks that we have available via Mirage Gate. But we've even seen super effective Blasters be a combination with the likes of Minior and Tropius as well for, again, different type coverage as single prize attacking options. So yeah, Lost Box can go in so many directions right now. It's actually why I'm not going to be talking about it in today's video, because it seems so creative and so wide that it's really difficult to cherry pick just like a couple of tech inclusions, because almost the entire archetype is like a tech box right now. That's kind of the identity of Lost Box anyway. But having Mirage Gate really gives you license to play all sorts of crazy nonsense, to be honest with you. So it's pretty hard to pin that archetype down right now. Every week it feels like it could be changing. So if you're already integrated deeply into the lore of Lost Zone, I'm going to leave that to you guys. Carry on as you are. And it feels like there's a lot of personal preference choice going on right now into which is best. Similar thing from you, actually. I'm not going to be talking about those lists today. I think it's pretty established that we have either a DTE-based like defensive Judge Pathy build of Mew, or a fusion-based build of Mew. They've both been succeeding pretty well in recent tournaments, so it's not really one standing way above the other. We've had like some decent top 16 placements in San Antonio with the DTE-based build, as well as a fusion build. So if you just look at the placements again, in Stuttgart it was a DTE build that did the best, but there's a number of fusion builds up there as well. So there's just continued success for Mew. We pretty much know its strengths and weaknesses at this point, so it's been talked to death right now. It's still a bit of dodge Charizard, but overall you know that you can outdraw pretty much most things in the game, and you know you're pretty decent into, you know, Snorlax, Intel Urshi. You have a decent game into Miraidon as well, which is one of your bigger boasts as like the high tier matchups. So there are still great reasons to look to play the Mew, but I again think that we don't really need to talk about those techs too often right now. So instead I'm going to be talking about Rapid Urshi, as well as the top 4 decks that you can see on the top left of the screen here. And then there's also Snorlax, which is really adapting also. Hale Olbernolty has done really well with a Pidgeot build, as well as Liam Halliburton. They had pretty similar 60s with a couple of changes. I think one of the builds was gear-based, and one just chose to play more individual cards in terms of like power cards, I suppose. But that also is a big sort of hurdle and big question mark, something new for us to test against in terms of how the Pidgeot build plays, because of course it can take prize cards, it can aggressively attack your hand with Fang Snipe. It's actually much more proactive than a pure like quad Snorlax passing build with just blocks sat there the entire game. It actually plays very, very differently. So I do implore you guys to practice against this build if you can, or at least put some games in yourself with this deck, even if you have no intention of playing it, just so you know how it feels, how it plays, what lines they can look towards. Because it feels like knowledge is power against the controlling decks. If you know what's in their 60, if you know what they're looking to do in terms of patterns and play, you can play much better against this archetype, which I do think contributes to your win rate. That being said, there will be archetypes in the sort of top performing decks that naturally are quite bad or naturally are quite good into Snorlax. So Snorlax itself as a choice is a bit of a roulette. You know that you're looking to face more Charizards, for example, than you are trying to hit Giratinas. It's just one of those things where naturally Tina has a ton of outs in the deck. Charizard typically can play none. So for me, it feels like Snorlax comes down to, again, preference as well as trying to time it correctly in the metagame. And then for some of these more fringe picks, oftentimes these are going to struggle with either consistency reasons, it's going to be because they are multi-prize focused and don't have favorable prize exchanges against some of the other top contenders in the game, or they're going to be too ability reliant or too narrow matchup spreads. These sorts of issues are kind of plaguing the other decks in the game right now. That's not to say that they can't have their chance to shine and can't push through on certain formats. We've seen a few breakout placements in top 16s for Roaring Moon. We've seen Goldengo do really well recently at the Kyoto Champions League, which again is a massive tournament. So these are notable archetypes, certainly, and it's good to have some experience against them, but they're not decks that I'm going to talk about today because I don't think they give you the best chance to perform at the highest level going into the next set of tournaments. With that being said, let's start with Charizard, one of the top decks certainly right now. It has accumulated the most points in the Battle Styles to Paradox Rift format, and it has been a pretty popular archetype among those top three in the last few regional championships, San Antonio included, where it was able to win the entire tournament via Azul GG, one of the strongest players that we have in the game, which is also just a fantastic endorsement for the deck in general, is that some of the best testing groups are saying that this is the best deck, and they've really nailed a pretty good 60. That being said, I have made a couple of changes from Azul's list, just reacting to it being sort of considered the top deck. Makes me feel like we could see a more aggressive metagame against Charizard going into Portland and going into Charlotte, etc., where I am wanting to play a Tool Jammer in the deck list as opposed to the Justified Gloves that was in the previous Charizard list that Azul did well with, and that's because I'm very worried about Technical Machine Devolution. Ironically, in the Kyoto Champions League, there were actually Charizard builds playing Devo as well as a Mirror Match tech card, so Tool Jammer can give you some defense against the Mirror, surprisingly, but also giving you defense most notably against Intel Urshi, which has really upticked. There's a number of Lost Zone Charizard decks as well, which will play TM Devo, and there are Valiant variants that will look to do this as well, simply because the hit points of Charizard is just too massive for these archetypes to deal with without using TM Devo. So the Tool Jammer, it's not going to be a foolproof strategy. Of course, these decks can play Lost Vacuum, they can play Escape Rope, they can still try and make this combination come together, but the decks I've just listed don't have the most robust draw engines available to them, so trying to combine their Technical Machine Devolution with these other cards here and there can be a bigger challenge for them, a bigger hurdle, which I think is pretty important to have in the deck list. It's also just a great card to have in the mirror in general if you are now worried about Justified Gloves. So I think it's a solid card. It's also just naturally playing into like Miraidon, for example, where you can now Arven and get yourself away around early Bravery Charms, which is sometimes a hurdle in that matchup. One of the only hurdles, admittedly, but it can be a hurdle nonetheless. So yeah, I think Tool Jammer is a small change. The only other thing I did was flip-flop Forest Hill Stone for Countercatcher. That's a personal preference change because I've been stung too many times with a prized forest, especially because there might be a number of players making you go first as well. So having a +1 opening card that's not a brick for you is pretty nice, actually. So this is my take on Charizard. Again, heavily inspired by Azul's winning 60 from San Antonio, but with that small tweak to try and respect TM Devo that little bit more. Onto Gardevoir, and this may be surprising to some, but this is still the second best point-earning deck in the Paradox Rift metagame, despite having a bit of fear right now of the amount of Miraidon that has crept up in popularity. So the metagaming is a little bit interesting for Gardevoir of War, where Miraidon can be considered a pretty challenging matchup. It's also not overly pleased with the amount of Intel Urshi going around right now, so there are still a couple of challenges for God of War, but I still think that among the other top contenders, it's pretty solid into Charizard. I think it's fine into Giratina. You'll notice my tech inclusion is actually Mew EX, which I'll get onto in a moment. I think it's pretty good into Mew, and it's pretty solid into just regular Lost Zone decks as well. So there's a lot that God of War still boasts, and it still can be one of the most robust and powerful draw engines that we have available, giving you the most control over the game with a lot of macro and micro decisions that you're trying to manage the entire time. So it's certainly a challenging deck, but certainly rewarding. And the reason why I like Mew EX right now is I think it gives you that help, that boast into Giratina. There really aren't many decks that I think want to come up against Tina in the top echelon right now. I would say really Mew wants to do that. That's only if the Tina isn't teching. As soon as the Tina adds in Spiritomb, or if they add Cleansing Gloves or something like that, then it's back into Tina's favor. So having this Mew EX to try and bully the sort of uprising of Giratina that I'm expecting in the next couple of weeks and months because of its great success in San Antonio, getting a second place finish as well as another top 8 finish, as well as just having a huge number of placements, and is generally seen as one of the safer decks in the game right now in terms of its overall matchup spread. Yeah, I think giving yourself a buffer into Tina seems really good right now, and it gives you a bit of a boast, I would say. We have seen Mew EX be successful before in God of War with Brent Tonneson, and I feel like it's kind of worth bringing this card back into the deck list to give yourself this solid matchup once again. On to Miraidon then. It's a really intriguing one where the highest placing lists have thrown caution to the wind recently in San Antonio and have gone Peony based, very aggressive with beach courts, but I feel like it might be time to once again start respecting the Charizard matchup that little bit more, respecting the God of War matchup possibly in a different way, I suppose, to just having very aggressive iron hands. This list still has, decent odds of getting early Ampy very much pressure going, but has the fallback of Judge and Path, which I still feel like is one of the safest cards that we have in the game that gives you a more clear win condition into Charizard. It's pretty solid into the mirror match as well, especially if there are going to be beach court based builds. I can't really look past how good Path of the Peak just is as a card, and I still feel like it gels really nicely with the Miraidon archetype, so this is still my preference. I think giving yourself a chance into Charizard when you can expect it to be pretty easily around that sort of 15% day one threshold, I think it's the most reasonable choice overall. Yes, the dump and draw option from Peony double Mew EX is pretty cool, and it does set the stall out pretty early. I really think when I look down these players' win rates and their record into Charizard, it's pretty abysmal. I feel like you're still not favoured necessarily with the list in front of you, but I think you are much, much closer in that matchup and have a fighting chance of actually getting ties and wins from Charizard players as you go through your day. On to Giratina Lost Zone, it continues to be the sort of 50-50 deck of the formats. Not necessarily the most consistent archetype, but certainly has game plans into the majority of the formats, and most notably boasts a decent chance into Charizard, as well as into Snorlax. This is one of the things that sets Tina apart from many other archetypes in the game right now, is that you naturally, just baked in, have a really good time into Snorlax, which few of our other top decks do right now. Charizard having kind of the worst of the top archetypes, Miraidon and God of War kind of being middling into Snorlax, and then looking at the Lost Zone boxes and the Tinas, these are some of the decks that do the best into Snorlax, as well as Mew as well, which can be a challenge for them. So yeah, it's really nice to just have this natural tick off the list that you're not concerned too much about that. You have defensive plays from Roxanne, Iono, Path, etc. And I'm really trying to go no thrills with the 60 right now, because how many times have you heard that this deck is just a pile, it's just a brick, it never really works out, there's a lot of things that you need to juggle throughout the entire game. That's certainly true of Giratina, and that's still going to be the case. One of the changes I've made from Grant Hayes' second place list is added back in Manaphy, mostly because I expect more mirror and a good amount of Lost Zone box, so it just seems like a worthy inclusion right now. But beyond that, I'm really not committing many spaces to anything but just the core consistency cards required for Giratina. You'll notice there's the Pokegear still snuck in the deck list for a little bit of extra help here and there. So I feel like Tina's best tech is probably keeping it simple, unless you want to commit a card into improving your Mew matchup, which I do think could be reasonable. I would personally lean towards Cleansing Gloves because it gives you more percentage into God of War as well. So that would be my tech choice, but not necessarily sure of where I would make my cut right now. Then finally we have Rapid Strike Urshifu. This list has been pretty well ironed out at this stage. change. The biggest change recently from Landon Kettler was going for the double 70 hit point Remoraid. It isn't a Rapid Strike Pokemon, but of course you can evolve Octillery, so you can still get Tower of Water's Retreat, so it's not a huge issue for you, and that 10 hit point buff is still helpful. It means you can actually put the Pokemon down in the mirror match, which I think is notable, and it gives you a little bit of extra help against these Valiant variants, which aren't all that popular, but still have to be respected here and there, so it's a minor thing. I initially was a little bit against it, but I do get the logic, and I think it's just about fine. I've gained confidence in the choice because it has done well recently, of course. Outside of that, the list is keeping things pretty simple. I also like the rope inclusion in the deck list because I'm already thinking of Tool Jammer. It's not the first time that it's come up in conversation, so I feel like it could be a consideration card so that you can have the Devo rope play available to you when required. I also actually have an Arven in the deck list to try and make it a little bit more reliable as well, which is a tiny note there, but overall that's how I'm liking my Rapid Strike deck right now. Overall though, what I will say is that getting bogged down in tech cards can be a huge trap, especially when you are going into tournaments of the sizes that we've been seeing recently, with easily over 1,000 players attending a lot of these tournaments. I think actually in Liverpool we could reach over that 1,000 threshold as well for Europe, which is going to be really exciting. So these tournaments are absolutely monstrous. You want to just keep it as simple and consistent as possible. I hope I've kind of conveyed that message with the minimalistic teching that I'm doing with the top tier tweaks, but that's my current take on the format right now. I have around a month for myself to continue testing, but as we know, as every tournament comes and goes, it's going to make adaptations to the metagame regardless, so I'm personally trying to be comfortable with a couple of archetypes so that I can change my pick if required, if anything crazy happens in the next couple of tournaments. I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. I am kind of intrigued by how the Kyoto results are going to be affecting the meta. Will we start seeing more Roaring Moon creep back into the game? Will we see anyone take the punt with Goldengo Palk? Anything like that I think is also pretty interesting. Even Urshi Valiant did pretty well in Kyoto, so there are some of these sort of fringe decks that are still getting decent placements and do have merits, like I mentioned, if you can metagame perfectly. I think almost starting in Portland, it's a bit of a reset, actually, because I believe it's going to be a slightly more aggressive meta against Charizard, and I do think that Miraidon is likely to cool off a little bit. Ironically, I think Miraidon's not a terrible play. If it's a more difficult field for Charizard, and if people are feeling safe to bring Gardevoir, maybe, who knows, it's actually a better time to be playing the Miraidon. That's the merry-go-round that we have to go through as metagamers and Pokemon players, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on it down below. What do you think of the deck lists? What's your favourite way to play these archetypes, and any other top techs that are on your considerations right now? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.